Elite athletes and high character. That was the name of the game for Chris Ballard in the 2019 draft. 10 picks, 4 trades from the Colts general manager over 3 days of the draft. I am Kevin Bowen. We're back. Another edition of Kevin's Corner on a Monday morning. Don't think we've had too many Monday morning podcasts, but we're coming at you this Monday morning because we want to recap a very, very busy weekend for the Indianapolis Colts as they wrap up the 2019 draft. Joey Molinaro is across the way. Joey, took a while to get going. Thursday night ended up being a bit of a wash. But once things got rolling on Friday, man, it was a lot of defense and just a lot of... Now I feel like after 3 drafts with Ballard, we have a great idea of the players that he's looking for.
Yeah, it was kind of like, when you're maybe going hard liquor on a Friday night, and it takes a while to hit you, right? Like you said, like you're sitting there, and you're like, what's going on? Then it just slams you like a brick wall, man. And that was what happened on Friday and then Saturday with the trades and the picks.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, captains,
came in hot and heavy.
Captains, all academic All-Americans, high character guys.
Exactly. That was a big, big theme. So on today's podcast, we'll definitely break down each pick for the Colts, all 10 picks. We'll get into Twitter questions. Let's hit on some early themes, Joey, and you just touched on it. The biggest thing that Chris Ballard, I think, had throughout this draft class was, again, these shouldn't say rare maybe, just elite athletes at their positions plus character. And when I say elite athlete, I probably mean more so this, Joey. I mean extremely high percentile for testing numbers. So we're talking, combine measurables. We're talking, jumps and, 40-yard dashes and 3-cone and shuttle and all that stuff. But there's also a bit of a baseline in terms of measurables that I think especially we saw on the defensive side of the ball in this draft. Colts had 7 defensive picks. I think that's the most of any team in the NFL here in 2019. They wanted to get a little longer, a little bit different body type, I think, on defense. And that's what we saw mostly with the athletic guys coming in at linebacker and at corner. If you look at some of the breakdown of these picks, and boy, I feel bad for Matt Taylor trying to have to pronounce some of these guys' names on a weekly basis. I'm going to go with Banogu. I'm going to go with Ban and not Banogu. I don't know.
It's how it looks phonetically, maybe.
Yeah. So, anyways, Ben set the combine record for defensive linemen in the broad jump and then also had the highest vertical jump of any defensive lineman in 2019. And now the Colts feel like those athletic traits offer him the chance to now move to linebacker. Then you go to Paris Campbell, that next pick in the 3rd round. I mean, he's a guy that I know we touched on the podcast leading up to the draft. I mean, you just cannot teach that raw speed. It's interesting. The Colts have taken, in the last 2 drafts, the fastest receiver in the combine, and then I'm pretty sure Nyheim Hines is the fastest running back in the combine in 2018. So that's 4.31 in the 40. And then to wrap up Friday night, they take Bobby Okereke out of Stanford, and he had the longest wingspan of any linebacker in the draft. And let's pump the brakes a little bit, but there are physical... If you look at the athletic sort of testing numbers with him, and again, you throw in wingspan, you throw in size, the closest sort of person that he replicates, if you will, is Darius Leonard. So that's what the Colts were going for there. And again, it's all about the measurables from a height, weight, length standpoint. I mean, length means a lot. It's not something that we usually hear, I think, as much as we hear in the NBA draft, but it certainly means something to the Colts. And I look at Bobby Okereke and see a lot of length there. And then when you get into the character aspect, I mean, hell, it seemed like everybody in this draft was a team captain. We'll get into the EJ Speed thing a little bit later when we break down each pick. But, man, Rock Ya-Sin, he transfers to Temple, and Temple has that thing where their toughest guys wear single-digit numbers. He wears a single-digit number. He's the first player, I think, in Temple history to be in the program for just 1 year and get awarded a single-digit number. So he made a very strong impression there. Okerike's resume, man, he looks like, gosh, I just think to myself, I was such a failure in college, like looking at what he did.
Just another Stanford guy, right? Probably like a double major in aerospace science and
exactly.
architecture.
It took him like 90 seconds to rattle off his major, and then he performed at Carnegie Hall. He interned with Condoleezza Rice. This is a guy that, Andrew Luck might actually have an ear in the locker room, when he's talking about architecture on the road trips and doing all that stuff. And then Khari Willis, who I think is a really intriguing safety out of Michigan State, Joey. Chad Henry, the Colts area scout for the Midwest, mentioned that he evaluated around 300 prospects, in his area in this 2019 draft, and he had Willis as a top 3 or 4 character guy in the entire area. He was the keynote speaker at the Big Ten Media Day luncheon last summer. So of all the Big Ten teams, Khari Willis is your guy speaking. I remember a few years back, everyone was gushing over Kirk Cousins' speech at that luncheon.
David Blau.
And it was Willis who did it this past year. So again, I think when we move forward in trying to evaluate prospects that Chris Ballard likes, he wanted to come into this draft with trying to find, I think, different sorts of athletes. Premium testing numbers were a huge key to him. And then also, if you can match that up with the high character, that's what he wants. And I thought he answered a lot of questions about character on Saturday after the draft, Joey. And he mentioned, look, shit gets tough during the season, you're 1-5. Are you going to be able to make it through the adversity and the hurdles that inevitably come over the course of a 16-game season? And if you have the high character and you wore that C on your chest for the vast majority of these draft picks in college, that locker room is probably going to be able to band a little bit together better than other locker rooms. And I think that's why he holds character in such high regard. And he obviously prefaced it by saying, look, we will take some chances, but it's too early in my tenure to go down that road. You
got him down. He does throw the look in there over a lot. When he's
look,
always with the look to start things off.
And I feel like he always prefaces that by knowing that he's doing something a little bit different than most GMs.
Mm-hmm.
And I've probably added that into my lingo more just because I listen to Chris Ballard so much. But I will say it. Look, every GM wants athletic guys, premium athletes, those top testing numbers. Of course, the freak athlete you want to get into your system. But to me, the character aspect separates the Colts a little bit more. Just they put character, arguably 1A on the board just behind those testing numbers. So I think the Colts are probably a little bit in the minority for how big a focus they put on the testing aspect of things and the combine and working out in shorts. But I would say they are in the vast majority for just how much of a premium they end up putting on character.
Well, you talked about a lot of defensive guys that were there and that were taken on Friday and Saturday, and that was the theme. Besides the high character guys, there was a lot of defensive picks for the Colts.
Yeah, adding competition to that defense, Joey, was I think the biggest focus for Chris Ballard in this draft. Last year was a heavy trench draft, and we'll get into that a little bit later, just the lack of trench guys we saw here in 2019. But defense was the theme. I mean, you had 7 of your first 8 picks on that side of the ball. Paris Campbell, the only non-defender that you took until round 7. It was really interesting to me. We heard all draft how weak of a linebacker group it was. The Colts took 3 linebackers. Now, Ben Benogu, and I guess I'm going to call him that throughout this whole podcast.
B squared. I don't know.
B squared was a defensive end in college. Now he's going to transition to linebacker. So that, wasn't a linebacker on paper. But, Ballard has taken 7 linebackers in his 3 drafts. And he said he's been on teams in years past where they've kept 7 linebackers, on their 53-man roster. To me, it's like, okay, I get keeping 7 from a special team standpoint, but you know what? There are a lot of teams you play where you only really use 2 linebackers for a vast majority of the game because you're playing so much nickel or so much multiple defensive back personnel. So I'm really, really curious and very intrigued to see how this defense evolves moving forward, because I think, I didn't shy away from it last year about wanting that defense to be a little bit more creative. I felt like at times they were almost too focused on simple
tackle
effort,
to catch.
Yeah, we're going to let give up a high percentage from a completion standpoint, but we're going to be right there. And you're going to have to go 13, 14 plays on us. Well, when you play the elite quarterbacks, you saw what happened.
Yeah.
So I think Ballard, and he was honest, and he actually said this, look at the quarterbacks that we're playing in 2019. I think that has played into some of the draft picks that the Colts made this weekend. And then also, this has just been his philosophical approach in taking over this job. I think he mentioned on Saturday, Joey, I want to say it's just 2 guys left from the Ryan Grigson era on defense. Once he traded away Hassan Ridgeway on Saturday afternoon, you have Matthias Farley and Clayton Geathers. That's it. Everybody else is from 2017 and on. Free agency, trades, draft picks, whatever. And I feel like this team now has just added some different body types on defense. Here's B squared, 6'4", 260 playing linebacker. What? The Colts don't have anybody on their roster that looks like that at linebacker. Here's EJ Speed, 6'4", 230. Even Leonard is what, 6'2", 225? The Colts just don't have those guys. And it was interesting to me to hear, okay, here's Benogu making the switch to linebacker, and he's going to play the Sam position. Well, when I hear Sam from last year, I think of Matthew Adams against these run-heavy teams. This is going to be a different-looking type of Sam. There are going to be guys in vastly different roles that I don't think we can pop on the 2018 film and say, oh, okay, that's where Ben Benogu is going to play. Okay, that's where, Marvin Tell is going to look like as a corner. Some guys, Okereke and Willis, they have some fits. Even Rock Ya-Sin. That's a 6'1" corner that played a hell of a lot of man coverage in college. And that goes back to something we've said. Ballard wants to play more man. And I shouldn't say Ballard, I guess. Ballard believes that Eberflus is going to want to play more man. Now you have some body types, some athletic ability with your personnel that I think allows you to be just more creative with that side of the ball. And I guess lastly, on the defenders, Joey, I will use this stat again. Since Antoine Bethea, it's been more than 30-some defenders you've drafted that have been eligible for second contracts. And none of them signed a multi-year deal. Well, now you look at what Ballard's done these last 3 drafts. I think you had 3 picks in the first 3 rounds in 2017. 3 defenders. You had 5 picks in the first 3 rounds in 2018. 3 defenders. This year, you had 4 picks in the first 3 rounds. 3 defenders. So that's what? 9 of 12? 9 of 12 picks. Premium picks on the defensive side of the ball. Not to mention, he's really rebuilt the defensive line through free agency from a starting standpoint. I think actually all 4 of them, all 4 of your starters, Sheard, Hunt, Autry, and Houston, all come via the free agent market. So this is the focus, and it goes back to, look, I think with Frank Reich and a generational quarterback, you can kind of get by maybe without investing the same amount of capital into your offense. Mostly at the skill positions. You obviously invested a lot on the offensive line. But from a defensive standpoint, this is an overhaul, and I'm very, very intrigued by some of these body types because I don't think there's exact fits. There's going to be some development needed, but just very unique bodies from what we're used to seeing on that side of the ball.
Yeah, I talked about it yesterday on Jersey Johnny about how, if Ballard had the chance to kind of jump the gun a little bit here in this year's draft because, last year 10-6, last year AFC divisional playoff loss, but he's not. You see he's still heavily committed, not letting that kind of flash in the pan, if you will, deter him from what he inherited when he came here in 2017.
Definitely. I remember when he took that job, and he was very candid early in 2017, Joey, of saying, this roster might be worse than I thought, especially on the defensive side of the ball. I mean, think about all the fat he cut.
Old and bad.
Exactly. I mean, just old for sure. And guys that weren't fits, obviously, for the 4-3 versus the 3-4 with Ryan Grigson and Chuck Pagano. He could have gone two ways in this draft. He could have been really aggressive with the draft capital that he had, but I always deep down felt like this was going to be viewed as another foundational draft in his eyes. He ended up turning, 9 picks originally into 10 picks, got a second rounder for next year as well from Washington, and really wanted to focus on looking back on it. He obviously wants to group, 2018 and 2019 drafts together. That's been the commitment to this rebuild.
Well, one thing that was interesting, and we were both kind of expecting going into Thursday and Friday, is that we'd see more defensive line trench picks coming in from Chris Ballard, and we didn't really see that too much.
And I'll also throw in the offensive line into that, Joey. To wait until round 7 for an offensive lineman, and I get it. You don't have much turnover in either of those groups. I mean, you've lost what? Matt Slauson retired. Al Woods is gone. I guess he traded away Hassan Ridgeway. I mean, that's it, really. So, and those guys barely even saw the field late in the season for different reasons. But I still was a little surprised for sure that we didn't see more of a trench focus. I would say definitely on the defensive line. You don't pick an end, Jerry Green, or maybe Gary Green. I don't know. All these names are so weird to me. I think it's Gary.
Really? Gerri?
I'm pretty sure it's Gary.
Wow.
Yeah. What a great spelling that's a very Southern spelling, I feel like.
Yeah.
He is your defensive end. Well, when you look at him, Joey, he played linebacker early in his career at Mississippi State. And I understand, 4 out of your first, 5 picks last year were in the trenches, Nelson and Smith and Lewis and Turay. And I felt like this draft, it would have been great for you to find that strong right defensive end. Justin Houston was a 3rd-round pick. Could you find a guy in the, if you don't, I get it. Montez Sweat, and we'll get into that here in just a second. But if you aren't sold on that in round 1, you come back in round 2 or round 3 and find that guy. And it looked like on paper was Ben Benogu that guy. And I think he will still have his hand in the ground at some points during the game, but he's not. I don't think you're 80%, 70% snap guy at that right defensive end, 5 to 10 years down the road. So that was a question that I had. You've once again, I think, really put, edge pass rusher that can also play on early downs on the mend for a couple more, for at least another year. And it was a very, a historically deep defensive line class. And you chose to ignore it until round 6. I thought defensive tackle, might have been a pick as well. There were some people that were, a little bit more attracted to Dexter Lawrence than most. We didn't see that wide body in there. So the Colts are going to be, not thin isn't the right word, but they certainly aren't going to be stout at defensive tackle from a weight standpoint. There's not going to be a big wide body in there in 2019.
Does that kind of speaks to the way the game's going, though, right?
The way the game is going, but then part of me is
in the division.
Look at your division, and that's where the pick of a guy like Willis in the 4th round. Okay, you're going to need that box safety because there are going to be games that arise where you do want a little bit more of a run focus. So that's something that we'll be curious to maybe judge moving forward. I think what this draft has also told us, Joey, is Anthony Costanzo. The Colts would love him to be a Colt past 2019. Not drafting a tackle until round 7, I think speaks to they don't maybe want to come up, outright and say it until they see what happens this season for Anthony Costanzo, but I think he is viewed as a definite guy that'll be signed to a third contract here in Indianapolis as he faces a contract year. He'll turn 31 this year, so maybe it is a sort of a 2-3 year re-sign for AC, and then you go to next year's draft and face the same sort of thing of like, all right, when are you going to groom that tackle? And I would have been more inclined, I maybe would have traded out one of the linebackers, Joey, for a trench guy. Drafting 3 linebackers, to me, like, where are all these linebackers going to fit?
Yeah.
It's a nice problem to have, but it's kind of one of those things where, all right, when you're playing nickel, Darius Leonard and Anthony Walker to me was, he was solid, and there's a cerebral nature to Walker that he's going to play. Like, maybe down the road, Bobby Okereke becomes a Mike for you, but I just don't know where all these linebackers fit for you. And that's why I would have subbed out probably one of them for either a tackle that you could groom and be that third tackle for you here in 2019, or that right end. So I think those are both needs that I don't feel like were totally checked off here in 2019.
Does that kind of speak to, I saw you put something in your article kind of recapping the draft, that speak to the belief of Kamoko Ture and Tyquan Lewis?
That's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up, Joe. Yeah, definitely. I was actually, 1070 The Fan had draft coverage, I think on Thursday and Friday, local coverage with Matt Taylor and that gang.
Yes.
And Taylor had on Chris Ballard before the draft started. And it was something that they had taped earlier in the week, but Ballard mentioned to Taylor that he had his scouts in the room last week. He asked them, where does Kamoko Ture, where does Tyquan Lewis fit into this historically deep defensive line group? And the scouts were very adamant that they felt like Ture and Lewis would be right up there with the guys in this 2019 draft class. So when you start thinking about down the road, and I know I've used this phrase a lot, passing the torch from this 31-year-old defensive line group that's currently in place as starters versus the next group, they feel like Lewis and Ture can definitely handle the early new age, what the defensive line group is going to look like come 2022 and things like that. So this is a big year. If I was Quincy Wilson, if I was Chester Rogers, if I was Matthew Adams watching this draft, Joey,
Seat's getting a little hot.
Yeah, I'm not loving it. If I'm Nate Hairston, I guess more so than Quincy Wilson, I'm kind of like, oh gosh. But if I'm Tyquan Lewis and Kamoko Ture, I'm like, hell yeah.
It's my time to shine, baby.
Sign me up, I'm loving it. Which always is like, I'd love to get some truth serum, on guys, on teams that watch the draft. It's kind of like, if I'm Reese Fountain and I see Paris Campbell going round 2, I'm kind of like, oh gosh.
4-3-1, man.
Yeah. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but I think that the competition level at receiver, linebacker, and corner, Joey, is loaded. Those are going to be great battles to make this roster.
Definitely can't wait till training camp. I know that. Jim Irsay talked after the draft, and we talk about a lot on this podcast. It's always a treat when you get to hear from Jim Irsay for multiple reasons, but it seemed like on Saturday, Kevin, this was a more cleaned up Jim Irsay. Like it seemed like his presentation, he was on it.
He was. Definitely. I think that's very fair to say. Look, Jim Irsay doesn't have a press conference without mentioning his belief in winning Super Bowls. Like, that just doesn't have, like, he always throws that in there. But I think there's some real confidence that even makes him stronger in his conviction of that. He threw out the line, Joey, like, he has this vision that the Indianapolis Colts are going to be known as one of the greatest franchises that ever existed. Greatest franchises that ever existed. Man.
Takes a visionary in that position, you know?
Takes a visionary, and the guys that he has in place, he couldn't be more happy with. He was really candid. I mean, he mentioned that Chris Ballard and Frank Reich, their harmony is an owner's dream, to be frank. And he touched on it. Ryan Grigson and Chuck Pagano, they clashed. And Jim Irsay had to, I don't know if meddle's the right word, probably not, but he had to, stick his nose in there when an owner doesn't want to have to do that.
Yeah, play the mediator. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you literally had therapists for your GM and head coach. Like, what? No. That's not how a business, should be run or things like that. So he was just gushing about, the same hymnal that Ballard and Reich are singing out of and all of that. He's obsessed with Ballard, as you would imagine. Calls him a savant in the draft room, has a very strong handle on things without being overconfident or cocky. But then also I think has a pretty good sense of humor to enjoy this climb, enjoy this rebuild that looks a lot more like a reload than anything. I thought Irsay was very, very candid with stating the goals moving forward. And I like this about him a lot, Joey. He's said this on several occasions now here in the offseason. We have to learn, and this is Irsay, I'm paraphrasing him. We have to learn from the Kansas City loss. Last year was a great accomplishment. Overachieve, 4 wins to 10 wins, win a road playoff game. That's great. But now you got to learn. You didn't learn from the Deflategate game. You didn't learn from that experience at all. And I just think Irsay has a very good grasp on knowing that game taught you some lessons. That's the barometer. That's the measuring stick moving forward. How do you get back there? Irsay said, point blank, we want to be a top 2 seed this year. We want those games at home in the playoffs. It's really hard to win in this league. It's really hard to win in the postseason. It's really hard to win in the postseason on the road.
Mm-hmm.
New England did it in the AFC title game, but it's just a little different. And hell, I guess the Rams did it as well, but it's just different to have to win multiple games on the road come playoff time. He also touched on, I guess, Indianapolis possibly getting the draft, Joey.
Needs to. Has to.
I couldn't believe it. Did you see the numbers from Nashville?
It was a lot.
600,000 people over 3 days.
Well, do you know what, I don't know, the NRA or the Firefighters Convention or any of those bring?
Yeah, I would have to look that up. And that's something Irsay mentioned that, they would have to get on board with, Visit Indy and Indiana Sports Corp to make sure that those sorts of conventions aren't going on during draft weekend because Indianapolis doesn't have the hotel space to juggle multiple events. 600,000 people, that is asinine.
Yeah.
How great are those videos of the bachelorette parties down there that didn't know the draft was going on?
I mean, inevitably, man,
How funny is that?
Just imagining them getting to Broadway and just seeing all that. That's pretty hilarious.
Oh, my God. Tootsie's, is this packed?
I mean, because that pile of people went 4 or 5 blocks deep on Broadway.
Yeah, my brother-in-law was down there, and he was like, you wouldn't believe how crowded Broadway was. I mean, just the absurdity of, you get multiple blocks away, and they have beer tents on the streets and TVs up. You weren't even really going into the bars,
right?
Too much. It was like Georgia Street here for the Super Bowl back in 2012.
Or essentially, if I picture it, the draft, if the stage was on the south end of Monument Circle, facing Meridian Street, that probably would have gone to the overpass.
Yes.
Down there by
South
Brothers.
Of Brothers. Yeah, definitely. And that's why I think some people were like, would you have it at the Motor Speedway?
I asked Doug Bowles that actually when I was interviewing, when we were talking to him on Jersey Johnny.
Yeah.
He said that he didn't think that it made sense at the Speedway. He felt like the Speedway was too big.
Yeah, I mean, you would literally have to put people on the track itself. And then it's like, is there enough in the background there to entertain fans?
Yeah.
Because everything, Broadway Street, boom, here are all these bars that if you want to, listen to live music or whatnot, you can slide into. But man, bachelorette parties gone bad in the city now.
And it's a learning lesson, though. Me and RC, we looked to make sure our locations for ours. I'm going to Chicago, so who knows what could be going on there that weekend. But
still, you can't be walking into anything too crazy.
It's a music festival or anything like that.
Right. A simple Google search could have solved a lot there for those ladies. And it'll be interesting to see what happens moving forward. Of like, okay, if the combine never leaves here, does Indianapolis get a draft? And then the last Irsay thing was, how about Quentin Nelson, one of the draft picks numbers, Joey? You see that?
I did, yeah. And
Yes.
that's
peak leadership out of Quentin Nelson too. This is
kinda
what it
speaks.
means to be a horseshoe.
Yeah, it kind of speaks to, like, I don't know if it's with the dance video of Cardi B and him kind of being more active on social media. Like, it feels like a continuous coming out party for Quentin Nelson in year 2, personality-wise.
Definitely. Being a little bit more vocal.
Yeah.
Off the field, I guess, and being a bit more of a vocal leader as well. When we heard that mic'd up video, I think there was more of a vocal leader out of him than we previously thought. And Frank Reich made a good point. He's like, I haven't had many offensive linemen that have done that. It's one thing if you want to text a guy in your position group that was just drafted, or if you're Andrew Luck and you want to text, Paris Campbell. But for an offensive guard to want to text, all these defenders that just got drafted, just goes to show you again why the Colts are so enamored with picking Mr. Nelson.
All right, let's go pick by pick.
Okay.
All of the draft picks from the 2019 class here, and we'll start not in round 1, round 2, pick 2. So, 34th overall, gosh, it's a rounding error. Essentially a first-round pick, Rocky Sin from Temple.
Name of the draft, Joey?
Yeah, I think so. I really do.
Rock Ya Sin. His first name has like 5 syllables and starts with A. His real first name.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, I think that Chris Ballard did a really good job for all the media people here. You got a Paris, so there's a lot of, wee and Eiffel Tower references you can make. Rock Ya Sin, bunch of church ones you can make. EJ Speed.
Yeah. Headlines galore.
Yes,
people.
exactly.
Yeah, people are eating up this draft class from a name standpoint. Joey, going into Friday night, I thought there was a good chance the Colts are going to trade back again. They're at 34. That's always a hot spot for teams to trade up. Drew Lock was still on the board. And I guess briefly before we get into Yasin, let's talk about trading back in round 1, Joey.
Oh, yeah.
Ultimately, and I know we touched on this on the 10, 15-minute podcast we had for you early Friday morning, this is how the 2019 draft, I think, will be judged for the Colts. What does Montez Sweat career turn into? I think the heart condition ultimately was why the Colts passed on him. And look, a ton of teams passed on him. He was a guy that was mocked, top 10, top 15, and fell all the way to 26. But you had your biggest need, a freak athlete, doesn't have the same character, I think, that, a lot of these other draft picks have. But the opportunity to get 6'6", 260, the guy runs 4'4", Jim Irsay's tweeting about him during the combine, like all of that without having to trade up. I don't think many people thought that Sweat was definitely going to be there.
Did you get to ask Irsay about that?
He didn't. We did, and he didn't touch on the whole medical thing or what the reasoning was with trading back. I know some people believe that if Josh Jacobs would have been there, the Colts maybe would have taken that pick. I feel like Chris Ballard is pretty steadfast in wanting to trade back. He believed in the depth of this draft is in the middle rounds. You got, 9 second-round picks? I think it's ended up being over the last 3 drafts. But it is interesting, Joey, this. In the last 2 drafts, Chris Ballard has passed on Bradley Chubb and Montez Sweat. Chubb, the best pass rusher in the 2018 class. Sweat, right up there with, obviously probably a little bit behind Bosa and maybe Josh Allen, but, right up there in a very historically deep defensive line class. And he's done that, Ballard, at his biggest position of need to really commit to, adding the draft capital, give me more darts, all of those things. Which is, last year I couldn't agree with it more. You had to do it. This year, I think it's fair to ask the question. And it came down to medicals, certainly. But if Montez Sweat goes out and has a great career, and the Colts are still searching for this pass rusher, years down the road, it will be something that I think we'll look back on it and judge it in a negative light to how this draft is being viewed. So yeah, moving back 20 spots initially to me was a bit like, wow, that's a lot. 26 to 46. But getting that second rounder in 2020, you're obviously banking on, hopefully for the Colts' sake, Washington starts Dwayne Haskins and they have a struggling year. Maybe that pick could be as high as, into the 30s, late 30s, like you were able to get. I guess that Jets pick turned out to be number 34 overall. But again, it's very fascinating that Ballard just is so committed to knowing, if I'm committing to this rebuild, I need the draft capital to do it. And even if some elite pass rusher is staring at me on the board, I'm not afraid to move back.
And that's what he did. And the first pick that they had was Rock Ya-Sin.
Yeah, so getting back to Rock, again, I thought there was a chance they'd move back, but they were just obsessed with, I honestly think, more of the competitor that Rock Ya-Sin is. Obviously, there's a lot of talent there, but they love how this guy just thrives on an island in one-on-one situations. I think the stat I saw, like, of the players that were targeted at least 50 times last year in college football, he was the only one not to allow a pass of at least 20 yards. This is a guy that brings a lot of cover one man background to the Colts. He's going to have to learn a little bit more zone stuff, but I think the Colts really like, okay, if you're playing a DeAndre Hopkins, he can kind of turn into that sort of, you're on an island, you do you. And that's where the wrestling background, I think, comes into play. This is a 2-time high school wrestling state champion, which, for an offensive lineman, for a defensive lineman, we wouldn't be that shocked by hearing that stat. But for a corner, like, you don't usually see that. And listening to Rock talk, he's like, look, hand fighting from wrestling helps me out in being a corner. I'm a very willing tackler because I look at, tackling guys, getting a takedown when I'm on the mats. I think he won it, I want to say 145 and 152. Wow. I think were the 2 weight classes that he won.
That's little.
Yeah, little for sure. Now he's the name fits his physique. Like, when you see him, I remember looking up at the combine and being like, damn, that dude's almost chiseled. Like, he is a rock, kind of statue-like, but then you watch him on the field and you don't see anywhere near, a sort of stiff corner. So the questions I have, Joey, is this: can he complete his ability to play in zone before you give him that starting role? And then secondly, I do think there is a bit of a step up in competition. I know Temple plays in the American, and they played Buffalo this year, which had a good quarterback wideout combo. But look, the guy played at Presbyterian before he went to Temple. Presbyterian, a very small school in South Carolina, FCS school, because Rock didn't play football until his junior year of high school. He said he had 3 hours to kill every day after school. Mom, wasn't coming to pick him up till about 6. He's like, might as well go out to spring practice after wrestling season's over. And, sure enough, later he turns in to a college corner, getting a scholarship. I think Presbyterian was on scholarship when he was there, and then they went down a level. That's why he transferred to Temple. Temple's coach at the time was Jeff Collins, who's now at Georgia Tech. Jeff Collins went to the same high school as Rock Ya-Sin. So that's where the Temple connection comes into play. And like I mentioned earlier, Joey, he had that single-digit jersey, and that's something that is very, very rare to have that. That's Temple tough is how they do that. So I think the Colts were just like, cannot pass on him. Cannot take the chance that if you move down 10, 15 spots, is he going to be there? Because we saw some mocks. I remember seeing some mocks having your Steelers take him at 20 overall. But it sounds like this is a guy that isn't afraid to talk a little bit on the field, which you usually get from corners. And I will say this a lot as we break down all these picks, Joey. I'm not going to sit here and say that he's a locked-in day one starter. It's a great problem to have. You brought back 21 to 22 starters. Maybe he ends up being in that nickel package for you right away. We'll see where Quincy Wilson ends up. But you would think the 34th overall pick at a position that, could have used a little bolstering, would eventually start. But Kenny Moore and Pierre Desir are pretty solid seasons for you. So I'm not going to commit to he's a definite day one 16-game starter right away.
Staying in round 2, pick number 17 in round 2. This is from the Redskins, 49th, right?
Yes.
49th overall, and B squared, Ben Banogu.
B squared, another transfer guy, transferred up, Louisiana Monroe, and then ended up at TCU. This is a guy that will make the transition, Joey, to the Sam linebacker spot. And like I said earlier, don't look at this as like Matthew Adams' Sam linebacker position from last year. I don't think we can look at Ben Banogu and think to ourselves, there is a player on the roster and a position on the roster like him. I don't. I think this is a new position the Colts will almost sort of create a little bit for him. He didn't play linebacker at all at Louisiana Monroe. They actually wanted to move him inside at Louisiana Monroe. They thought he had the frame to add some weight. And when he transferred to TCU, they're like, no, dude, you stay at end. You're 6'4", 240, and you run 4.6. Like, you're going to be an end. He was the Big 12 Newcomer of the Year in 2017. He was actually the preseason Defensive Player of the Year this past season. I think he had, I want to say like 8.5 sacks, something like that. So didn't win Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year. But, his testing numbers and the jumps show the explosive athlete that I feel like the Colts believe he can now play in space, because he is going to have to play in space a little bit more at linebacker. But at TCU, their ends, look, Joey, the Big 12, they don't play much defense at all.
No.
But TCU, I think, is known as one of the few teams that actually like to play defense. Gary Patterson's a guy that you have to do a lot in their defensive scheme. So he had a lot of responsibility in coverage, making reads at that end spot. And I guess projecting him with the Colts at the Senior Bowl, he played some linebacker and did some things in space where the Colts felt like, wow, if he does that in just a week with NFL coaches, what can he do with us when we put him there full time? So there is a lot of development needed here. There isn't a crystal clear picture of exactly what he looks like in the Colts defense, but this is an incredibly intriguing athlete. And the size, 6'4", 249, I think he is listed at. Again, the Colts just don't have those body types on their roster at linebacker. So I'm really, really curious, Joey, to see okay, Banogu, Anthony Walker, Darius Leonard, how do those linebackers play out? When you're playing run-heavy teams, is Matthew Adams now outside looking in against the Derrick Henrys and the Leonard Fournettes and those sorts of teams? So those are all things that I'm very, very curious to find out about B squared.
Last pick of round 2, 59th overall, already a fan favorite, Paris Campbell.
Can't teach speed, Joey. I went to an IU game 2 years ago against Ohio State, and I will never forget watching 21 in white turn the corner up Ohio State's sideline and thinking to myself, holy shit. That dude has got a gear that no one else on this football field has. And I would say this, when Big Ten draft picks get picked, the game film against IU usually shows up on ESPN or NFL Network's clip montage.
Who was that on Thursday night? I think it was Noah Fan or Hawkinson.
Both of them.
Somebody.
I was at that game as well this past year. So my sister-in-law goes to IU, and we probably go to like 2 games a year. And fortunately, we've been to games that at least have NFL talent on the opposing sideline. But I remember walking out of that stadium this year and being like, "What? Who are these tight ends? Like they just ran all over IU, and like IU's bad, but they're not like freaking playing Presbyterian."
Well, one of the analysts was like, he basically said, he's like, "This isn't Presbyterian. This is the Indiana Hoosiers." I was like, "Is that does he know or?"
Yeah, I was gonna say we were watching that in the draft room, and I distinctly remember that phrase, and I'm like, "Look, it's IU football,
right?
Like, yes, they're Big Ten in football because they're centrally located and they have a great basketball program." Like,
yeah,
but yeah, I just remember watching Campbell and being like, dude, that guy just has a different gear. And Joey, when you watch him run with the ball, he's not some track guy that like just runs a bunch of yards to get away from people. He's very efficient with his running. Like he was a running back in high school. So I think you see him very comfortable with the ball in his hands. Mm-hmm. And he knows his speed full well, but he can do some things side to side. And I thought the stat that really stood out to me, which I absolutely love on Frank Reich, Campbell had 3 catches last year over 40 yards. So 3 very big plays. 2 of those catches occurred behind the line of scrimmage, and the other one was like a 5-yard route. I mean, think about the yards after catch with those plays. And the Colts were flat out terrible in yards after catch last year. Terrible. Campbell's going to fix that in a hurry. You don't need to give him touches. You don't need to give him low percentage touches to turn into big plays. I go back to the crossing routes and the underneath stuff and the jet sweeps. You can do all of that with him. He can be a gadget guy like Nyheim Hines, but is much more explosive than even Hines is, which is saying something. And I also feel like there is potential there to grow the route tree because that's something Ohio State didn't ask him to do. He was Percy Harvin for Urban Meyer. He was the H-back, the slot, and Ballard said, look, Frank Reich was intoxicated watching Paris Campbell work out during the combine. Not just during the 40, but also running a full NFL route tree. Like, look, he can do these things. Ohio State just didn't ask him to do that. They didn't need him to do that. They can still be a great offense without overloading him too much. Chad Henry, the area scout, had a great line about Paris Campbell. He came in after the draft on Saturday and said that the first time he watched Campbell, or at least got, really entrenched with his film, was last summer. He emails Anthony Coughlin, who is the Colts head of college scouting, who went to Ohio State. I think he might have even been on Urban Meyer's staff at some point. So Chad Henry emails the Ohio State guy and is like, bleep, 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 bleep. Like, what is this speed? We have to get this guy on our team. It's just a rare speed. And I'm all about diversifying the skill sets on that offense and the wideout group. And look what you've done this offseason. You get the bigger body in Funchess. Now you get a game-breaking athlete in Campbell. You're stressing the defense in multiple ways. I am a huge fan of the Paris Campbell pick.
The only 3rd-round pick they had, 89th overall, and that's Bobby Okereke.
Nigerian descent for a few draft picks for the Colts. Bobby Okereke and Ben Banogu, whatever. Okereke, Joey, long arms. I think the biggest wingspan of any linebacker in the draft. And who does that resemble?
Darius Leonard.
I mentioned it earlier. The athletic makeup, the traits replicate a lot of the portfolio that Leonard has. I want to say Okereke is like 6'1", 235, 240. I want to say high 4'5", low 4'6". So similar to Leonard in that. I was listening to a podcast with him yesterday. They asked him during the draft process who he wanted to sack the most in the NFL.
Andrew Luck.
Andrew Luck.
Wow. Is it just a Stanford connection? Or
I think so, yeah. And he mentioned on the conference call he knows Andrew from, Andrew coming out and working out in Palo Alto during the offseason. So that's kind of funny. Most guys say like Tom Brady or something like that. So Okereke, once obviously his time at Stanford never overlapped with Luck. And I guess that's something that I wanted to mention with Campbell. Campbell, same draft class or same recruiting class as Malik Hooker at Ohio State.
Wow.
Very young, was a 16-year-old freshman.
What?
Yeah. I think maybe 17. Maybe when he signed his letter of intent, he was 16. Which, I mean, think about it. High school senior at 16, really, really young, was Paris Campbell. And then Bobby Okereke, he ended his career with 40 straight starts. So you like the durability. I think Okereke, out of these first 4 picks, Joey, might be the most ready. And I say this by there's no real position switch. He doesn't have to round out his route tree like Campbell. And he played at Stanford. High level of competition there. Maybe passing downs for him early on. I think Mike ultimately is where they want to try him out at. But, when does he get the cerebral nature of a Anthony Walker? Right? I think some of the negatives with him were like, doesn't get off block like no other. Mm-hmm. I cannot stress that enough. They came into day 2. They had about a handful of guys that they really, really wanted. These were 4 of them. And the fact that you didn't trade back from Rock Ya-Sin and still were able to get, 4 of these guys, that is why I think, I know we saw the picture of Frank Reich jumping for joy in the draft room, war room, and I was kind of like, is this a Paris Campbell reaction? I think it was more so of we got the 4 guys that we really, really wanted coming into day 2.
That was a big fist pump from him, man.
That was big. Frank
really
Reich.
Was, yeah.
I love the emotion.
Yeah, for sure. First pick of Saturday, round 4, 109 overall, Kari Willis out of Michigan State.
They traded up 20 spots for him, Joey. That's a lot. The last question Chris Ballard was asked at his Friday press conference was like, it's interesting. You didn't take a safety. And he, gives some answer like, oh, we feel really good about our safeties. You got Hooker, you got Gathers, George Odom, Matthias Parley. 12 hours from now, I'm going to trade up 20 spots to get
why not?
A guy that they thought about in round 3. He mentioned that Kari Willis was even a guy that could have gone in round 3 for them. You obviously had the need at safety. I've mentioned how strong of a character this guy has. I think this guy might have the best chance to play day 1, Joey. And I know that might surprise some people, but I think, if Clayton Gathers is at all nicked up, this is a guy that's going to have a great opportunity to play. Box safety is where he's most comfortable, but the Colts want to make it clear he can do some other things. He's a versatile safety for you. So, yeah, it's a guy that I think this time next year could be a starter, certainly, and I feel like he might play a pretty good amount from day 1.
2 fifth-round picks, 144th overall and 164 overall. Marvell Tell, cornerback at a USC, and then E.J. Speed, linebacker from Tarleton State.
Yeah, Mr. Tell, 6'2", 195. Again, a different body type. Played safety at USC, going to play corner here with the Colts. They love the athleticism. They love the length. Had a very strong kind of short area testing. Think about, 3-cone and shuttle and those things. Very good short area quickness and strong in the jumps as well. It sounded like teams were pretty split on safety or corner for him. And I guess the Colts are going to try to do with Tell what they couldn't do with TJ Green, and they probably waited too long to do with TJ Green. And I know that might scare some people, but I think what you like with Tell is you're doing it from day 1. You waited quite a while to do it with Green. And also with Tell, he's a guy that you feel like has shown a little bit more of corner action on film than, or at least I guess slot action on film than TJ Green was pretty much just a deep center field safety at Clemson. This is a guy that I don't think you need him to play early on. That's a good thing because it is a bit of a project with him. But the body type, 6'2", 195, they don't grow on trees at the corner position.
And then the next fifth-round pick, 164 overall, EJ Speed.
Yeah, and the first thing, when you look into EJ Speed that you probably noticed is the criminal issue. And the Colts make it clear that they don't feel like that's an issue at all. I want to say it was something to do with like credit card identity, or it sounded like a very smart crime for what it's worth. And this goes back to what we touched on, Joey, on the pre-draft press conference. When we talk character, there are all different kinds of character. There are all different kinds of crime. Domestic violence and drugs, whatever, all of them are in their own different category. And the fascinating thing to me about EJ Speed is this. On March 6th, the Colts had no idea who EJ Speed was. And on April 27th, they spent a 5th-round draft pick on him. Mm-hmm. That to me is just, it's almost astonishing. He works out at a pro day. The Colts aren't even at the pro day. They were at TCU's pro day, which, you understand why, in that area they weren't at. I don't know if it was Tarleton State's specific pro day or just a pro day for that conference. They're in the Lone Star Conference, which is where Chris Ballard has a lot of history from his coaching days before he became a scout. But the pro scouts for the Colts see the testing numbers that get sent to every NFL team about EJ Speed. They see 6'4", 230. I don't have the exact testing numbers, but I think it was, again, like 6'4", 230, around 4'6", very Darius Leonard-like. And they're like, who is this guy? We got to do more work on EJ Speed. So they bring him in for a top 30 visit. They take him out to dinner. They find film on him. They do their vetting in terms of the background checks. They aren't worried again about the arrest because the felony charges were eventually dropped. For EJ Speed. I think it was first-degree and third-degree felony charges. Both those were dropped. And they feel, great about the athlete. And they want to see what they can get out of him. He was a high school quarterback, turned receiver. Claims he had offers from like Colorado and Oklahoma State. Went to Tarleton State because his adopted brother had cancer. He wanted to stay somewhat close to the Fort Worth area where he's from, and thought that his brother could eventually recover, and then they would play college football together. And unfortunately, that never happened. His brother passed away, but that, I guess, explains a little bit of the story of why he went to such a small school. It's a Division II school, and that's the biggest difference. Obviously, there's a lot of differences between trying to compare him to Darius Leonard. But at South Carolina State, Darius Leonard had film against Clemson and played in the Senior Bowl. EJ Speed doesn't have that sort of film measuring him up against elite talent. So I think that is the biggest difference in trying to compare those two. He might have had the quote of the draft on a conference call. Said he has a fetish for making spectacular plays.
Wow.
A fetish.
You don't see it described that way too often.
You don't hear a lot of NFL players use fetish to describe on-the-field activities. Mm-hmm. And if he has a fetish for making spectacular plays, I'd love to know what he would call the film on Darius Leonard from last year.
That's some X-rated stuff.
I was going to say, that's not safe for work. So that's EJ Speed for you.
All right, 6th-round pick, 199th overall. Jerry Green, D-end out of Mississippi State.
Yeah, this is our G squared, man.
Yeah, true.
He'll be defensive end. Played linebacker a little bit in college. Played D-end last year for obviously a loaded defense. Montez Sweat, Jeffrey Simmons, Jonathan Abram, all on that defensive group for Mississippi State. How are they not better? Right?
You see that a few times, like LSU when they had Beckham and Landry and
Clemson
Jeremy
had those
Hill,
loaded wideouts.
Sammy Watkins, Montavis Bryant.
6'4", 250, runs 4'6". Stop if you heard that out of me before. Team captain. He actually picked off Jacoby Brissett in his early college days. That shows you how long he was in college. Played a little linebacker early on. Again, Joey, it surprises me they waited this long for a defensive end. He'll get thrown into the mix, with Kamoko Turi, Al-Qadim Muhammad. And he's going to have to prove himself just to make the roster because you do have some depth on the defensive line. But, yeah, that is Gary Green.
And then 2 7-round picks. Hey, we saw the 7-round picks make the squad last year. So these guys aren't throwaways by any means. Jackson Barton and Javon Patterson adding to the O-line.
They aren't throwaways, Joey, but much tougher. Linebacker needed a huge overhaul last year. The O-line, they have a lot of depth pieces. And LaRaven Clark and Jamarcus Webb and Joe Haig and Josh Andrews and Evan Boehm. We heard Chris Ballard say that they're going to pick up the fifth-year option on Ryan Kelly. That is due this Friday. Barton is a long tackle from Utah. If a couple tackles go down in camp or even one goes down, Barton could definitely make this roster. And, can Howard Mudd, can Chris Strasser groom him to be, more of a 3 or 4 year backup Joe Wright sort of guy? Who knows? Patterson, very durable, played all the interior spots at Mississippi, not very tall. Again, it'll be difficult for these guys to make the team. But we know injuries happen on that O-line group, and I did think it was important to get a tackle and a guard in this draft.
All right, time for some Twitter questions. Let's start off with Andrew Fisher. Strongest and weakest position group after the draft?
Ooh, boy. Strongest, I will say, damn, that's a good one. Maybe O-line. I mean, I know the depth maybe isn't what you want it to be, but I still think that the talent is pretty strong. If you're going by numbers, strength in numbers, to steal it from the Warriors, I'll probably go with honestly secondary. I think you have a lot of numbers there. Now, some quality has to emerge, but now, in terms of weak, I still think, do you have the run-stuffing defensive tackle? Do you have – I would say where I point to weak, it's just you have some unanswered questions still long-term at tackle and at defensive end. And in general, just a couple of depth questions of like, okay, do you have enough quality depth at running back? Do you have enough quality depth long-term at tight end? I was a little surprised we didn't see a tight end taken either. So, those are some of the questions I got.
So is there a difference between the deepest and the strongest and the deepest position?
Yeah, I mean, I would say strongest, for me, it comes down to more like top-end quality, whereas deepest is obviously just really hard to make the team sort of question, which I think receiver and linebacker and corner have improved significantly in that area.
That was Darius Leonard Hype Train's question. What's the deepest on the roster? So,
nice.
Got it.
And this will probably be a bit of an abbreviated Twitter questions. We're running a little long on the pod. Look, we're going to have time to talk about this draft for the next 4 or 5 months, but we're going to hit on a few here for the next 5 or 10 minutes.
At Super City Indy Fan says, one, still looks like there's a need on D-line even with Lewis, Turay, and Ward. In my opinion, could use a big body. Any veteran free agent you see us adding?
Yeah, I know some people throwing out Ndamukong Suh, Danny Shelton. Ballard really likes Grover Stewart, who was a 4th-round draft pick 2 years ago, is the wide body on your roster right now. He's 320, 30-some pounds. So I'm not sold on that. But if I think there was an area on defense to add a vet, it would probably be in that area. And then on offense, do you re-kick the tires on one of those running backs, Spencer Ware, Jay Ajayi? I know they really like Jonathan Williams as their 4th running back. So those would be maybe the 2 areas I could see a vet coming in.
All right, from Jonathan, considering we have a top 5 GM in the league, would Ballard ever take the New York Giants job if they backed up the Brinks truck? Is he that type of guy?
No, Midwest guy. He's got Andrew Luck. No, terrible question.
From Skoog, haven't heard from him in a while. Good that he chimes in.
Yeah.
He says, Andrew Luck suggests a book to you that you know you're not going to read. You see him a week later. What is your strategy for BSing through that conversation?
Talk soccer. Talk architecture. Yeah, I mean, read Cliff Notes. Is Cliff Notes still a thing?
That'd be tough to slide by him.
Yeah, I mean, he's going to catch my bull. He's going to sift right through my BS. I'd cry. I just, I don't know.
I don't look forward to that conversation.
No, I'm sweating thinking about it.
Without a doubt. Drew Masterson says, after free agency and now the draft, this team doesn't feel like it's rebuilding, more like a reload. Do you agree?
I think that's fair. Yeah, it does seem like more. The depth in this roster has improved so much over the last couple of years. So yeah, I think you are definitely trending more towards reload than rebuild.
Aaron says, do teams ever consider the depth of positions of next year's draft when making decisions on the current draft?
I think that's a good question. Yeah, I think some teams do. It's probably a bit of a down-the-radar look, and that's why I was kind of like linebacker was such a weak, class this year, but yet the Colts made 3 picks there. It sounds like early on next year, wideout is pretty deep. Certainly not the same defensive line haul, though, that we saw here in 2019.
Clayton Clifford says, I love the competition Ballard has created. When you go down the roster, there are a lot of guys who will get cut. Who are your 3 surprise cuts this year?
Oh, boy. Well, I think you're going to cut a draft pick at linebacker and corner. Whether that's Zaire Franklin and Nate Hairston or, whoever that ends up being. But I think you're going to make cuts there. Wideout, I know a lot of people have probably asking about Chester Rogers. What Rogers has going for him is punt return ability. And I think Paris Campbell did kick returns. I don't think he did punt returns at Ohio State. And, could your 5 wideouts next year be this? Hilton, Funchess, Campbell, Kane, Rogers? So you're cutting Reese Fountain, Zach Pascal, Marcus Johnson. Yeah, look, it's going to be a battle, but I think Chester Rogers' ability on special teams still makes him pretty attractive to the Colts, and maybe keep 6 wideouts if you can, pinch a number somewhere else.
This is from Lucky Boy 215, spelled with an I, too. With the addition of Rocky Sin, how many corners do you see the Colts having on the roster, and do you think this is a make-or-break season for Quincy Wilson?
Yeah, I do. And I would say that for pretty much any, second-round pick going into the 3rd year of a rookie deal, and he hasn't been a full-time starter yet. But Chris Ballard loves Quincy Wilson. He mentioned it on Saturday, just the versatility, the different spots he saw Quincy Wilson play last year, whether it was a nickel outside corner or it was a dime linebacker when you had some safety injuries as well. I will say the Colts keep corners Yasin, Tell, Moore, Desir, that's 4. Wilson's 5. Boy, Hairston and Jalen Collins are going to be in the dogfight. I don't know, because you probably keep 10 defensive backs. Maybe you pinch a number at safety and keep a 6 corner. I don't know. The Colts seemed to like a dime look last year with Matthias Farley versus having an extra corner out there. So these guys better be willing to play special teams. That's all I'm going to say.
Last one here we'll do from Connor. He says, how many of the draft picks do you see starting week 1 versus the Chargers?
Starting.
Yes.
I'll say none. I think if you go out in a 2-wide, 2 tight end set, Campbell's not going to be out there. You go out in a base defense set. Well, now that I say that, maybe Ben Benogu as that Sam linebacker. If you open up a nickel, maybe Rocky Sin is in your nickel packages. So, yeah, I will say 1. But I don't, it's not, we knew this time last year, Joey, Quincy Nelson, Darius Leonard, no-brainer starters.
Yep.
No-brainers. We don't have anyone. I think that is a definite. There is going to need to be coaching and just overall development needed on guys like Benogu and Tell and Yasin. And there's the fine balance of you don't want to overload people too much from a mental standpoint because you want them to play fast, but you also have to put these guys at different positions than they primarily played in college.
All right, man. Sorry we're going to get to more, but what's the rest of the week look like?
We got rookie minicamp later this week, and then we'll also have Colts film session with Chris Ballard, I think, at some point. The Colts haven't put down a hard date on that yet, so we will come back next week's podcast and cover a lot of that. But we wanted to get you a podcast earlier in the week recapping the draft and covering those things. If I didn't get a chance to get to your question on this pod, just tweet at me, and I will answer it over there. But let's, definitely 1070thefan.com, Joey. We had, I think, 15, 16 stories from the draft. We'll have a ton more draft-written content all week. So 1070thefan.com, Colts coverage tab is your place to be for all that.